All right, people of the internet, put a glide in your stride and a dip in your hip and come onto the mothership because Stone Fruit and Mark French are going to dish out yet another edition of the hard line according to Stone Fruit directly into your eyeballs and your ear holes because the desired effect is what we get when we enhance our interplanetary funksmanship. And there's going to be some funksmanship today, my brother.
Oh yeah, laying it down.
Let's do it. So, today's episode is Decolonization in Peak Anthropocene, a case study examining the value of Hawaiian sovereignty towards the end. So, what we want to look at, I propose, my brother, in fun and intellectual crime, thought crime. Let's define the West. And the global South. Let's expand the conception of the power elite and the military industrial complex. But here's a big thing we're adding. Clarify who's served by power in this era of the terminal ecological overshoot, in which not only our obsessive favorite topic, neoliberal international finance capital, but Chinese state-led capitalism, socialism, every type of economy is going down the tubes. And we're going to introduce some concepts like overshoot, peak everything, the great acceleration, and anthropocene. So let us begin with, what is the West? It is both a place and a concept. And obviously we can start with Europe. The Venn diagram of the EU and the Schengen visa area and NATO. And then, of course, the G7 is another vital block. And that includes Japan. So then we begin to start to see how it's a concept as much as a geographic place. And since South Korea just joined NATO's Cyber Command, they too must be considered a part of the conceptual West. And both Korea and Japan are hardcore garrison states for the American military imperialism abroad. What Chalmers Johnson called the empire of bases. Have you read any Chalmers Johnson?
Yeah, absolutely. I believe he was a Stanford guy or a USC guy. But yeah, and on top of that, his actual career when he was with CIA, I believe, or one of the connected security agencies, like Ray McGovern and other people that were in the alphabet soup agencies in their current modern iterations, at the end of their career, even when they thought they were right as young men at the pinnacle of their careers, in their 50s and 60s and 70s, became blatantly obvious to them where the missteps were. And then to take it a little bit further, they no longer care about being vilified, right? They're at the end of their career.
Yes.
And they gave great service to the country. So they don't care telling the truth. They're not scared of vilification any longer. They don't want to hang on to this stuff going to their deathbed. So yeah, on top of reading some of this stuff, there was a fantastic series of interviews that he gave before passing I probably listened to him speak directly about many of the themes of his books, probably 12 or 14 hours at least. I listened to him talk on some of the major themes of his work.
Yeah, you, as usual, you nailed it right on the head. And he used to say, I was a spear carrier for empire at our favorite think tank in the sunny climes.
Was he at Rand?
He was at Rand.
Yeah, oh, that makes sense. Sure.
Yeah. And his specialization was base base structure abroad, American base structure abroad.
Hmm.
And he started focusing on Okinawa. And he said, what are we doing to Okinawa? And I think that was the beginning of his turn towards seeing how devastating empire was.
Sure.
And he wrote a book called Blowback that got published right before 9/11.
Yeah, that's right.
And then someone called him and said, Chalmers, we just had the mother of all blowback. What? The World Trade Center. Of course, that's if you believe it was actually done by Al Qaeda and masterminded by a dialysis patient in a cave in Afghanistan instead of an inside job. But blowback is, of course, the term of these intelligence and paramilitary operations that go awry.
Hmm.
And then he wrote another book called Sorrows of Empire. And before his third and final book was Nemesis, and taken as a whole, these three books are like incredible
Masterworks. Absolutely.
masterworks of dissecting the national security state and American militarism on the world scene and everything. And I want to read you the closing quote of Nemesis.
Hmm.
In early 2003, on the eve of the invasion of Iraq, I was putting the finishing touches on my portrait, The Sorrows of Empire, of the global reach of American military bases. In it, I suggested the sorrows already invaded our lives, which were likely to be our fate for years to come. Perpetual war, a collapse of constitutional government, endemic official lying and disinformation, and finally, bankruptcy. At book's end, I advocated reforms intended to head off these outcomes, but warned that failing such reforms, Nemesis, the goddess of retribution and vengeance, the punisher of pride and hubris, was waiting impatiently for her meeting with us. He punches in bunches.
Yeah, and there it is. And I mean, you know, as we're able to start seeing so much of this stuff in the rearview mirror and in hindsight, the sanctions regime of the United States is now directly affecting its own poor and working class. By sanctioning everyone and completely trying either destroying supply chains, it's why inflation's not going anywhere. Not only are they pumping all of this fake money into the military, so you have DC with the highest average salary in the entire country when those people don't even do anything but make war, surveil us, lobby each other. It's so you can kind of see how the sickness is the system as it starts to leak and leach into everything like lead pipes everywhere.
maybe not DC itself, because even though it's gentrifying, it still has a substantial black population. But the
Sure.
the counties surrounding
The
DC
surrounding area. Yeah.
are full of McMansions paid for by military industrial complex contracts.
Sure.
So as we continue to try and figure out what is the West, let's look at Singapore because they're kind of an odd duck.
Yeah.
They participate in RIMPAC, which is a periodic, primarily naval, multi-nation, American-led military exercise over a few weeks. And, they send a few small boats, but they also are a major financial center for the non-SWIFT, non-USD world.
Mm-hmm.
And we're talking about de-dollarization a lot. And I just saw Katie Halper interview Richard Wolff on de-dollarization
Yeah.
a day or two ago, and I'm like, did he see our podcast?
Right.
We're ahead of the curve because he was talking about exactly the stuff that we talk about.
Yeah.
But he said that the USD was 40% of the world reserve currency.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was 58%. But
Right.
I'll defer to Richard Wolff for sure.
Yeah.
So if it's already down to 40, that's news to me and very surprising. So to finish defining the West, of course, we talk about who we have talked about often, the Five Eyes Signal Consortium, which is all the Anglo-American settler colonial countries, United States, UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and all of the groups that we mentioned. It's a Venn diagram. So now let's flesh out what is the power elite and what is the military industrial complex and how can we expand it to be a useful conceptual model for today's mayhem and murder.
Sure.
We need to start with C. Wright Mills, who was a black leather jacket wearing, motorcycle riding, pipe smoking sociologist in the 50s, not cut from the tweedy cloth of the Ivy Leagues.
Sure. One of the final beats.
A beat in academia.
Yeah, that's right. Uh-huh.
And died young. And I have my suspicions he might have been because power elite, he got a little too close.
During the McCarthy era, would that be a surprise to anyone? Usually if it smells that way, walks that way, and talks that way, it might end up going that way.
Yeah, it might be a duck.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Eisenhower's legendary speech on the cautionary tale against the power of the grave and gathering military-industrial complex. And then activist and founder of Veterans for Intelligence Veterans for Sanity, Ray McGovern, had his beautiful Mickey mat, which is the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academic think tank complex. That's an incredibly useful development of Eisenhower's military industrial complex.
Mm-hmm.
And even though he's alive today and very active and on YouTube all the time, laying down the hard line.
Yeah.
Speaking truth to power, and in his golden years too, and probably not given, zero fucks given.
He doesn't care if they whack him. He's gonna keep talking now.
Yeah, but we mentioned a few things to add to it in our last chat, but I made a more systematic list. So I think to his Mickey Mat, we need to add big tech, the consulting firms,
Sure.
McKinsey, Booz Allen Hamilton. A lot of the tax firms have consulting arms.
Absolutely.
The so-called fact checkers of what Michael Schellenberg and Matt Taibbi of the Twitter Files fame,
Hmm.
uh, like Stanford Internet Observatory Complex, University of Washington, Gravitas, a few others. The big foundations who neuter formerly useful sources of news like PBS or Democracy Now,
Hmm.
and by their money set so many parameters on the conventional wisdom. That's a great term from John Maynard Keynes. The powerful law firms, many of which are partisan, many of which are nonpartisan, and many of which are K Street lobbyists, but let's add that as a separate category, the K Street lobbyists. And since we have entered and will never ever leave a new biosecurity regime of social control, we must include big pharma. They're not just an industry. They're utilized as a mechanism for social control now, because they kept us in lockdown for 2 years. The jabs turned out to be a bunch of fucking bullshit. Nigeria was vaccinated at 1% and had 1/15,000th or maybe 1,500ths of the death rate that America did
There's
on
just a
one.
peer-reviewed study that just recently was released that clearly stated the more injections you got, the easier it was, the easier and faster it was for you to get sick.
Yes, sir. Yeah. So it was all bullshit, but it doesn't matter because it's a new biosecurity regime that we're dealing with. And we need to look at the dark money groups.
Hmm.
There's left and there's right. There's one that really fascinates me, Arabella Associates. Are you familiar with these guys?
I'm not.
They are a corporatist dim dark money source that can marshal hundreds of millions of dollars every election cycle. They're kind of half nonprofit, half super PAC, and they have a very unique structure which is able to keep the dark money untraceable. They have 4 subsidiary nonprofits:
Sure.
the New Venture Fund, the 1630 Fund, the Hopewell Fund,
Yeah.
and the Windward Fund.
Well, and then listen to what you just said. If a wing of it is a nonprofit, but it's essentially just becomes a corporate pass through to move this money along to the offices that they want to buy. So so it becomes a tax deduction as well.
Yeah, they're so enormous and so effective that any corporatist dim donors just say, oh, just give your money to Arabella Associates and they'll take care of it.
Sure.
And what they do is those 4 nonprofit super PACs, I don't know if they're 501c3s or super PAC. I think that's 506. I shouldn't speak out of turn. There's
Sure.
different designations,
Hmm.
but those 4 entities fund and incubate hundreds of subsidiary corporatist democratic activist and policy change groups individually. And then they pay Arabella Associates, a private corporation, management fees, consulting fees. So as a nonprofit manager, I say that that's a brilliant structure.
Yeah.
And it's a really effective way to provide a single point of entry for any big money donor that wants to just throw money at one group and know that it can filter down to hundreds of groups. They were instrumental in getting Ketanji Brown to be the nominee for the Supreme Court and all sorts of stuff. So big dark. I've heard them called the Koch brothers for the left. Since one died, Koch brother.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that it reinforces, as you lay this out so clearly and succinctly for everyone, is these odd duck locations like Singapore and Kuala Lumpur and other. So this reinforces to your point that money isn't patriotic, regardless of what these competing geopolitical devices say and state publicly. There's always places, Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, Panama, to where these firms and corporations and individuals still use these capital flight locations to get exactly what they want as individuals, regardless of what they're trying to have done for them by any specific nation state or group thereof.
Yeah, I was thinking this morning that, oh no, I focused on like the 1% of America. No, it's the 1% of all of these all of these states in the West that have no fealty to their nation at all.
None. Yeah, that's right.
They have fealty to their class.
Yeah.
They have fealty to their overall military and imperial goals and corporate rapine goals, but they have no fealty to their country. So they
have total commitment to Roman style oligarchy. That's what they mean by freedom. That's what the word freedom means to them. The freedom for plutocrats to do what they want, to exploit people and resources.
Worldwide.
Worldwide, absolutely.
Working as a class worldwide.
That's right.
Using the power of the nation state when it suits them and when they can.
It's as their mafiosi strong arm wing. Yeah, it's as their muscle. That's it.
But not giving a rat's ass about the country. They're cosmopolitan citizens of the world.
That's right.
This 1% of all of these countries of the West that we've identified.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, as we talk about big pharma and the biosecurity regime, everybody seems to have forgotten about the Nuremberg Code of 1947. All of these heinous medical experiments / torture that Germany conducted were rightly reviled, and they created the Nuremberg Code that you had to have informed consent for medical experimentation. We are not being given informed consent for our military, the military medical experimentation that they're conducting on us.
Yeah, it's take this or get dishonorably discharged and kicked out.
Or not be able to go anywhere or board a plane or
sure.
And losing your business without any due process or not being secure in your person and papers, you know.
Yeah.
So many aspects of the Constitution are out the window permanently under this new biosecurity regime?
Driving from my Montana place to visit my family in Seattle, at the outset, I was turned around by the Washington State Police, and they were just like, "Why are you here?" And I was like, "I'm going to Seattle." I was like, "I have traveling papers." And they were like, "This says that you live and work in Texas and you live in Montana." And I was like, "That's true." And they were just flat out like, "Then you're not allowed in Washington. You have no business here. Go home."
That's disturbing.
It was weird. It was one of the weirdest police interactions I have ever encountered in my life in this country.
Papieren bitte. And they're pulling surfers out of the water in LA
Right.
during the pandemic while they're in the sun getting fresh air, which is one of the best things you can do.
You can do it. Sure. Yeah.
Good Lord and butter, as they say in the South.
I mean, I took two of the doses just because of my travel schedule, just to make it a little bit easier. I felt kind of obligated to do it.
Yep.
And I still caught it 3 times.
Right. Even Anthony Fauci, who has been multiply boosted, caught it, I believe, at least 2 times.
I mean, some people say that, it made it less severe than it would have been. How the hell am I supposed to know that? I mean, there's no way to.
It turns out to all be complete bullshit. It's just a mechanism of social control,
Sure.
and it's not going away.
Yeah.
So now let's delve into the 1%. And I want to stress again that this 1% is transnational. But for us, the 1%, because that was the great slogan of the Occupy movement, and it's good to have a slogan like the Bolsheviks.
Yeah.
Red, land, peace. It's best conceived of as a 0.01% of old dynastic wealth, and the 0.99% are the technocrats. And those technocrats are the people that are in the military industrial complex, expanded to the Mickey Mat, expanded to what we just discussed. That's the 99.99% that serve power and uber wealth. And that they exist in every country in what we have defined as the West. So what is power? Where is it exercised? How is it exercised? Is it in a star chamber, like the straw man that they call the conspiracy theorist version of the straw man? Well, what do you think? They all just sit around in a dark room and decide everybody's fate? No. They meet at regular meetings, like now the now notorious World Economic Forum.
Yeah, not everything has to be a creepy hooded orgy like Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut. Like they also do it in the daylight in $5,000 suits.
Although, why did he die so suddenly after making Eyes Wide Shut?
Right. Yeah.
So the obvious meetings to think about are World Economic Forum, Bilderberg, and Trilateral Commission,
Mhm.
which is trilateral is Europe, America, Japan.
Yeah.
And this year's Bilderberg was held at Pristina Palace in Lisbon. And I took a gander at the participant list. I'd like to share a few names with you, Mark.
Sure.
Stacey Abrams.
Right. What the hell is she doing there?
2-time loser for governor. Anne Applebaum, a writer at the Atlantic, which has turned into a neocon rag,
Yeah.
who is married to that former foreign minister of Poland, who sent out that tweet right after the Nord Stream bombing,
Thanking the U.S.
saying, "Thank you, U.S."
Yeah.
So she's a real piece of work.
Right.
Well, they all are. Albert Bourla, CEO of Pfizer, of course. Jose Manuel Barroza, Goldman Sachs International. Jorge Brenda, World Economic Forum president. Christopher Cavoli, Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. Shashank Joshi, defense editor of The Economist. Alex Karp, Palantir. Palantir focuses on predictive policing, full-on Minority Report stuff.
Sure. Wow.
Which is the inevitable future.
Well, I mean, look at every direction is going that. All of these alphabet agencies. I mean, people, the military budget's exploding. I mean, and that's just what they tell us. So the dark budgets for all of this spying and authoritarian technocracy, that's the other problem with such massive bifurcation. Even normal people leaving school that do a lot of this computer science for a living, that's where the money's at. These are normal people at the beginning of their careers that just want to make a living. So I don't even think they really know half of what they're about to get into when they're hired to do this stuff. But these departments are getting massive.
Predictive policing is a extraordinarily ominous development,
Absolutely.
which I have no doubt will be welcomed readily by our corporate and government overlords.
Yeah.
And let's look at just ripped from pages of today's headline. Cop City, that development outside of Atlanta, where they're destroying 85 acres of a forest to make a little town to practice police tactics, which I'm sure will focus on de-escalation.
Yeah, right.
They've already made a martyr out of one of the protesters who was sitting cross-legged with his hands in the air and was shot 57 times.
Wow.
And they have also gone so far as to label contributors to the bail relief fund for the other protesters as terrorists.
Yeah, here it comes. I mean, just like the people that donated to the truckers in Canada got their money shut off. I mean, this is the evolution of the social score. It's all going this direction. Absolutely.
This is where we're going.
Yeah.
This is where we're going.
And I mean, that's how depraved the plutocrats and the oligarchy are. They are willing to hoard all of this wealth to rule the underlings with a very heavy hand going forward.
Yeah, and at the municipal and state cop level, you get these guys with 95 IQs and give them militarized police forces. And at the national police level and the alphabet level, a little smarter but more devious. And as this story progresses today,
Sure.
The money that these guys are hoarding doesn't matter because ecologically we're fucked. And
Yeah.
we'll develop that theme as we go along. So that was a little sidebar just into Bilderberg.
Sure.
So that's how power's exercised in these meetings where they calibrate rhetoric and set the agenda, and by the means of having their similar institutional and educational backgrounds. It's not the star chamber, it's that way, the way I just described. So, as we discuss who is the West, who is the global South, it's massive. And like the West, it is both a place and a concept. Obviously, it would include Africa and South America. West Asia, the phrase West Asia, the Indian State Department, India, their State Department has a West Asia department, and much of the world calls it West Asia.
Mm-hmm.
It's really only in the Anglo-American world that we call it the Middle East.
Sure, that's right.
Which is an interesting bit of nomenclature.
Mm-hmm.
Global South would also include South Asia, Southeast Asia, China,
That's
Russia.
Right. Yeah.
And I would posit Eurasia east of the Ural Mountains.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, the big topic of our chats is the power of the West is declining relative to the global South, especially against such groupings as the BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Eurasian Economic Group. And in the wake of China's monumental infrastructure project, the Belt and Road Initiative, whereas all America does is kill people and break shit,
Yeah.
China shows up, writes checks, and builds infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
Who do you think which choice do you think most nations are going to make?
Well, and that's such a good point that you make. I mean, even if we just stick to American foreign interventions just since Vietnam, I mean, these have always gone poorly. It doesn't help anyone. The IMF, the World Bank, drone striking people, collapsing countries, picking dictators. I mean, all of this greed and thievery has led to absolutely nothing implanting these pliable regimes anywhere. It's all led to misery every single time. I think the cat's kind of out of the bag on this structure, and people are starting to realize that.
Well, Saudi Arabia did. That's why they signed a military accord with Russia.
They are getting out while the getting's good. The writing's on the wall.
America lost Vietnam. America lost Iraq. America lost Afghanistan.
They destroyed Iraq. It's still a failed state.
And for all these failures and losses, they racked up a bill of trillions of dollars.
Yeah, Libya, Syria. I mean, they're African engagements that no one talks about.
They're making a base in Syria. America is making a base in Syria.
It's crazy.
While they're hypocritically talking about the sovereignty of Ukraine.
It's ridiculous.
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And we've killed 25 million people just since the Iraq War.
Yeah, that's right.
And if you look at the William Bloom's classic book, Killing Hope, which has little 6-7 page vignettes on like 60 instances of American major invasions, covert operations, paramilitary operations, election interference. It's like 60 lists, 60 incidents in that book, just up to Iraq. And it's really, I think, from Iraq on, that the American empire is really in obvious, precipitous decline, in a way that's obvious to the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the global South is also saying they're accelerating de-dollarization,
Hmm.
because SWIFT and the dollar are being used as a weapon, and they don't want any part of it anymore. I was surprised. I thought the America as a reserve currency was 58%. If Richard Wolff says it's 40, it must be 40. But it it's proceeding with the utmost speed.
Well, and not only, regardless of where it's actually at this time, which I haven't bothered confirming or looking it up, but I have no reason to disagree with Wolf. I mean, he's a sensible person whose math is generally pretty solid. He has no agenda towards any specific nation state. His direction is merely philosophical and critical. But to add to your point, the annual decline over the last 5 years is mounting. The percentage of which nation states are moving off of it is increasing by percent yearly, rapidly. It's almost exponential.
Indonesia is just finishing up and getting ready to roll out their own national payment card to completely abandon Visa and MasterCard.
Mm-hmm.
And currency swaps, the incredible increase in gold buying, Turkey, China, India, Russia.
The sanctions regime it's created a hyperactive feedback loop that is giving them exactly what they don't want, even faster. You could not have invented a better method to get everyone to de-dollarize any faster than it's happening right in front of everyone's face right now.
Biden, Blinken, Newland, Sullivan are so inept and so ideological and such corporate whores,
Yeah.
that they could not be destroying the dollar faster than if they had set out to do so.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I mean, it's and these central bank digital currencies, are going to get brought to the fore even faster because of it.
And those are all proprietary
Yeah,
and means of social control within nation states.
absolutely.
They're not on the blockchain, which is
Yeah.
uncontrollable.
Mm-hmm.
So, using international prices, the BRICS are already larger than the G7.
Yeah.
The BRICS have 26% of the global economy compared to G7's 25%. And everybody in the fucking world is lining up to join BRICS.
Yeah.
In November of last year, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said 12 countries wanted to join the BRICS.
Yeah.
In May of this year, the South African ambassador to the BRICS, Anil Suklal, said that more than 30 countries want to join.
Yeah, that's right.
From 12 in November to 30 now. So I put together a roster, and I found two countries that are new to me since our last chat, Mark.
Mm-hmm.
Kenya and Tajikistan. But here's the complete roster of everyone that's in the queue. Afghanistan, Algeria, Argentina, Bahrain, Bangladesh, Belarus, Egypt, Indonesia, Iran, Kazakhstan, Kenya, Mexico,
Mhm.
Nicaragua, Nigeria, Pakistan,
Mhm.
Saudi Arabia, Senegal, Sudan, Syria, the United Arab Emirates, Tajikistan, Thailand, Tunisia, Turkey,
Yeah.
Uruguay, Venezuela, mucho oil,
Well, no,
and
that's
Zimbabwe.
yeah, and to your point, listen to that list and you add in what they have as far as mining, rare earths, oil, gas, food production. I mean, uh, you are talking about powerhouses in their regions of what could be possible if they are just able to be paid fairly, to trade fairly, not have their debt denominated in dollars. I mean, you are talking about completely different economic situations for those countries if they're able to move forward as a bloc in that manner. And you bring up really interesting points about China because as China ages out and they have no way to care for their elderly population, and by unwinding from the West, they're also going to turn into their own version of a consumer economy. So they're going to have a ton of old people to look after medically. Maybe that's what they can do with some of their overbuilding and empty thousands and millions of apartment units. But as they turn into a consumer economy, you make so many interesting points about them needing to legitimize the yuan because they're going to need other people to trust their money to buy the inputs and services that they need to unwind their population boom in some kind of halfway civil manner.
And the petro yuan is already in operation.
That's right.
And it has a substantial informal gold backing.
Yes, that's right.
And the BRICS are going to make their own trade currency.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll still be able to hear you. I got to step aside for a moment.
Okay. And the BRICS, I'm so curious about what's going to happen at the BRICS meeting on August 22nd to 24th in South Africa. And the South Africa ambassador to the BRICS, Anil Suklal, was asked, are you considering changing the venue so that you don't have to arrest Vladimir Putin? And she said, get out of here. Forget about it. We said it's going to be in August 22nd to 24th in South Africa, and that's when and where it's going to be. And he will be our welcome guest.
Yeah.
But you mentioned that these are all very resource and food production and commodity rich nations. So I took a little gander at their relationship to oil and their membership in OPEC, just as a one marker of
Oh, sure.
that broader topic.
Yeah, that's a relevant overlay.
Yeah, and here's what I came up with. Okay, OPEC's 13 members now are Algeria, Angola, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Libya, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Venezuela. The 5 members of OPEC Plus are Russia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Mexico, and Oman. So that means that if all of that long list of all the countries that I itemized
Mm-hmm.
all join, then the BRICS will include 6 of the 13 OPEC members
Yeah.
and 2 of the 5 OPEC Plus members.
And I thought Tajikistan was also on or near the Caspian and also had significant reserves. I don't remember what's going on in Tajikistan.
There's the whole Caspian basin is very rich in oil and natural gas, so they might
Mm-hmm.
be a participant in that. And I believe the Belt and Road Initiative touches every OPEC country.
Yeah, that's right.
So this is a striking development, and
Mm-hmm.
we could say it began in earnest in the 5 or 10 years after China ascended to the WTO.
Well, and then the other thing that's going to make it fun as well is with Lula back in power in Brazil, they actually have a competent leader now. So things could progress very quickly. Argentina's a little bit messy currently. They have a really hardcore right winger that's in the running to potentially become the leader of Argentina. But if they choose to stay in line with Uruguay and Brazil and some of their other neighbors, and try not to go the Colombia way of being a vassal state to the United States, basically, if they go another direction, that could also be a very interesting development. I mean, Argentina has leaned so heavily into right-wing monopolized oligarchies. It's always been a mess because of inequality there.
They're definitely on that list to join the BRICS,
Yeah,
and our favorite Coke fiend Zelensky
yeah,
is trying to charm the BRICS, and he met with Modi, and Modi said, "Listen, kid,
yeah,
I don't care about the geopolitics of your war.
right.
I care about the humanitarian crisis it's creating, and that can only be addressed if you sit down and talk to Russia.
Yeah, that's right.
If you are willing to do that, I'm willing to help. But if you're not, stop flapping your gums at me, boy."
Yeah, because Ukrainian wheat legitimately feeds a lot of people over there. I mean,
But Modi just fucking bitch slapped Zelensky. Said,
yeah,
Shut up. Stop talking."
yeah,
And I think that probably sent Zelensky into a cocaine bender, so he was not fit to visit Lula. So he stood Lula up.
sure.
And Lula, and someone asked Lula, "Are you disappointed?" He said, "I'm not disappointed. I'm angry
Right,
because this was a scheduled visit between 2 heads of state, and that was just blown off."
right.
So this began after China ascended to the WTO. And okay, yes, all of these international efforts of the global south, they demonstrate a lot more international solidarity and what China calls win-win approaches than is found in the West. But in the end, it's still all based on international trade and domestic consumption, whose fundamental foundation is the exploitation of a finite biosphere.
That's right.
And here's where we're going to make a pivot into the ecological situation that we're in, that no one is talking about. In a seminal classic written by Catton called Overshoot, he wrote, "We must learn to relate personally to what may be called the ecological facts of life. We must see that those facts are affecting our lives far more importantly and permanently than the events that make headlines." Now, his fundamental thesis was that ever since the Industrial Revolution, when people started using coal and then oil, the population just skyrocketed exponentially. And there was a correspondingly exponentially skyrocketing consumption of natural resources.
Mm-hmm.
So we've been living beyond our means for centuries. And a concept closely related to overshoot is the Great Acceleration. And there's some very iconic charts that demonstrate how, beginning around 1950, man's impact on the world and consumption of resources has developed even faster than that graph from the Industrial Revolution. So it's
Mm-hmm.
got even worse.
Yeah.
And it's not stopping. And another concept very close to the Great Acceleration is the Anthropocene. And I find this a very fascinating concept. It's really, really close to Great Acceleration, but it looks at man's impact on the world as just going multiple orders of magnitude worse than it was even since the Industrial Revolution.
Sure.
But it just marks it a little earlier with the dropping of the atomic bomb in 1945.
Mm-hmm.
So Great Acceleration kind of starts around 1950. Anthropocene starts around 1945. But Anthropocene, they were thinking of it in terms of these uh, time scales that we're in from a stratigraphic perspective. And the International Association of Stratigraphy said, no, we're not in the Anthropocene, because even though there's been a big impact by man on the world, it's not yet in geological strata. So, according to them, we're still in the Holocene. But Anthropocene is still a very potent concept in popular culture and sociology and the humanities.
Well, you're also experiencing so many of the symptoms contemporarily, like it's happening right now.
Before our eyes.
Yeah.
And these Catton's ecological facts of life, they require a profound appreciation of how far we've already overshot the human carrying capacity of the earth.
Sure.
And there was another book by Heinberg called Peak Everything. It builds on the concept of peak oil. Since you're in Texas, you may be familiar with peak oil.
Absolutely.
Would you explain it for our 5 listeners?
No, you would do it better than me. I'll leave that to you.
Okay. Peak oil is this notion that in every oil field, in every country in the world, there is a moment when we have reached the peak amount of how much we've extracted.
Yeah, it's only going to become harder and more expensive to even have access to it any further. And current supplies are just going to continue to dwindle.
And they're going to continue to dwindle to the point where it costs more to pull a barrel out than the value that you get from it.
Sure.
And we're past peak oil.
Have been for some time, if I remember correctly, 15 or 20 years, maybe?
I believe you're about right. And
yeah.
So Richard Heinberg in his book Peak Everything builds on that concept that we're not just out of oil, we're out of everything.
Yeah.
And I hate to call it natural resources because there's got to be a better word, because they're not resources for us to exploit.
Sure.
I'm a mystic, and I think that we're related to everything, even the water and the soil and everything. So I really dislike the word resources, but I don't know what else to use. But we're out of all the natural resources.
Mm-hmm.
We're on the back end. The bill is due.
Yeah.
There's no solution in sight, and no one is made cognizant of the fact or takes the initiative to attain this knowledge.
Yeah. Well, and it's going to be one huge, interesting interplay between China and South America is how many countries are going to be willing to starve their own populations and degrade their own ecosystems to feed the Chinese for money. Like you can't eat money and you can't drink oil. It's going to be really interesting to see how everyone else decides to feed the Chinese the next 50 years.
And with what?
Yeah.
We are out of everything and no one is talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
So now let's segue to modernity, especially American conceptions of late modernity. Last time we mentioned Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, which focused on the television age. And we're in a qualitatively different world than the television age now with the internet and smartphones. Completely different. But in addition to his book, I want to bring up Marshall Berman's All Is Solid Melts to Air and Morris Berman's Dark Age America, The Final Phase of Empire. And these three books, and All Is Solid That Melts into Air, I think comes, well, I believe I know. Well, okay, somewhere between think and know. Comes from the Communist Manifesto. And I meant to pull up that quote because it's a barn burner. And I think I've heard the Communist Manifesto referred to as the Sermon on the Mount of Modernity.
Mm-hmm.
I said that to a writing teacher, creative writing teacher in my master's in English, and she said, "That phrase will fall through the earth." But these books, they're prevailing themes. The prevailing themes of late modernity in America, and I would argue in all of the core states of the quote unquote West, and
sure.
more and more the global South,
Yeah.
are anomie, which is a lack of social bonds.
Yeah.
Ennui, social isolation,
Mm-hmm.
a general dumbing down of the populace, and rampant consumerism as the primary mechanism for self-presentation.
Sure.
So consumer capitalism gives us consumption, an ontology predicated on having, which is increasingly attenuated anyway.
Yes.
And this notion was first brought up by Veblen way back at the beginning of the 20th century with his notion of conspicuous consumption. I think he was focusing more on the robber barons, but now it's become available in some diminished form for the middle classes and even to some extent the working classes as well. But for the uber rich, that 0.1% that we discussed earlier, there's a relentless, systematic, vicious corporate rapine. And I've been watching a lot of Robert Kennedy Jr. speeches lately.
Sure.
Oh, brother Mark. In 2004, I joined the Hawaii State Democratic Party to be a Dennis Kucinich delegate
Sure.
at our state convention. And 2016, I paid absolutely no attention whatsoever to the presidential election. And then in 2020, I was, who's this Bernie Sanders fella?
Mm-hmm.
He's talking about all my issues. And then he's kept fucking saying, my good friend Joe. Senator Sanders, do you think Joe Biden can beat Donald Trump? Yes. Well, then why are you fucking running?
Yeah.
And of course, Obama made a few calls, and after Clyburn secured South Carolina for Biden, then Obama made his calls, and everybody dropped out and appeared on the stage together and anointed this walking corpse as the appointed, not elected, the appointed chief executive. I think his cognitive decline is even worse than it was at that moment in the election.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and even aside from that, I mean, it's just even if you were an insurance salesman, I mean, just looking at an actuary table, it's just math. I mean, the exponential increase of his imminent demise literally goes up monthly. I mean, it's just guys in their 80s. They just
Yeah,
don't. They could really croak at any minute.
right. Once you get into the 80s, it's a whole different ball game.
Yeah, and I mean, and everyone ages differently, but nobody can say that that guy is, you know, at full capacity. It's just
He's not
not
at
the
any
case.
capacity.
Yeah,
Did you just see that fall he took?
I did. Yeah, I mean, maybe it could have been some loose duct tape and a badly placed mic wire or something. It seems like if that was your job to set that up, you would have been a lot more careful. But yeah, it was at the Air Force Academy in Colorado, and yeah, he flat out bit the dust. So whether it was an object or a bad step or whatever, he was not able to handle that gracefully at all.
But more than gracefully, for the elderly, it's falls that can really take you out.
He could have really got hurt. Yeah, I literally could have stereotypically shattered the hip, right?
I mean, George
Um,
Burns was still performing at 100, and then he fell in his bathtub and died in a week.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, the
George
things
Burns was still one of those fellas that was sharp as a tack at 100,
sharp as a tack. Yeah.
but then he fell.
Hmm.
It's falls that are so dangerous for the elderly.
Yeah.
And I detest Biden as a person, politician, and he's been integrally responsible for most of the worst pieces of legislation of the last 40 years. The Telecommunications Act, Glass-Steagall, quote unquote welfare reform, the crime bill. He's been a booster for the Iraq war, NATO's war against Yugoslavia. There's very credible sexual abuse or assault charges, allegations against him. He loves to sniff and sexually assault minor females. He's a uniquely heinous person.
Yeah.
Which is why his children are so fucked up. Having said all that, when he debated Paul Ryan in, I believe it was 2012, who was Mitt Romney's VP candidate, he was very verbal.
Yeah.
And ran circles around Paul Ryan, who had a reputation as a policy wonk. But now he can't.
Paul Ryan's a great speaker.
But yeah, and he had a reputation as a policy wonk, but I think Biden beat him.
Yeah.
Because he could still speak. And now he cannot.
Yeah.
And he can't walk. He can't walk and he can't speak. He's a Weekend at Bernie's cadaver that's just serving as a front man for our expanded version of the Mickey Mat. And corporate.
Well, and I mean, it so vulgarly exposes the complete vapid, vacuous hollowness of the Clinton-Obama regime. I mean, it's just a continuation, like Donald Trump's about to be reelected in a landslide. Like, how many elections do Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and Bill have to lose? The Democrats are completely willing to lose to continue their oligarchy project and just wag a finger of righteous indignation at the evil bad guys that are supposedly a little bit worse because of identity politics or whatever. They are in complete lockstep synergy economically with what the donor class wants.
Because they don't really care to win.
They don't.
Either party. Because they can just sit it out at a think tank or in academia.
Yeah, that's right.
Wait until the people vote against the party in power.
Yeah.
Not for anything.
Mm-hmm.
So I was a Kucinich delegate. Then I joined again to be a Sanders delegate. And then I was so infuriated about what a sheepdog Sanders turned out to be.
What a terrible way to end your career.
No.
Just when he told Hedges and Kshama Sawant, I don't want to get Ralph Nadered, then what? Then your whole thing was fake, man. You basically just stole hundreds of millions of dollars and, even more importantly, ripped the hearts out and hope of an entire generation that thought they could actually make a difference. I mean, you just spit in the eye of all the people and ideas you supposedly supported.
Abandoned generations, plural.
Plural.
And he was asked about Ukraine, and he said, "Oh, it's not an issue I follow that closely, but I support President Biden."
Yeah.
And just the way he completely abandoned his principles wholesale, abandoned his movement wholesale, proved himself to be a sheepdog for the vote blue no matter who crowd.
Oh, so bad.
I thought, I'm fucking done with the Democrats. God damn them.
Yeah.
And I voted green. But
yeah.
But now I'm listening to RFK Jr. and I'm oh God, I have to have enthusiasm for another Democrat again. And I'm listening to a lot of him. And I got an interesting factoid out of him. He said in 1970, 62% of the income in the United States went to the middle class.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's 42%.
Yeah.
In 1970, 29% of the income went to our exact figure, the 0.01%.
Yeah.
1970, 29 to the 0.01%. Now 50% does. Those numbers are damning enough, but that's income.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah,
That's not wealth.
no, that's not wealth. And to your point, when you start talking about wealth transfers, Rand released a study of wealth transfer that went from like 76 to 16 or something thereabouts. They released it in October, November of 18 or 19 or 20. But the Rand study showed clearly the transfer of wealth from working people to this 0.1%.
And in the
All the
pandemic,
siloed monopolies, the numbers match exactly.
we've had the greatest upward transfer of wealth in the history of mankind.
Yeah, that's right.
And the
Again.
CARE Act was just giving trillions of dollars to
Yeah.
BlackRock and all of those heinous people on Wall Street.
Well, and that's after the 08 transfer to Goldman Sachs and Bear Stearns and all that. I mean, that's Obama.
Who was the greatest destroyer of black wealth ever.
Yeah, absolutely.
The worst person for black people ever.
Mm-hmm.
So in the West, it's transnational. I want to emphasize transnational. The 1% circulate around the world. Transnational corporate socialism that privatizes the benefits while it socializes the costs.
Yeah.
And these costs are that we have to bear, these externalities are in part because every government agency in the United States, certainly, is captured by the industry that it's supposedly regulating.
Sure.
These include even agencies like the CIA, State Department, and Department of Defense. And the industry they're captured by is the military industrial complex. And lest we forget, the Department of Defense was called the Department of War up until 1947 and 49.
Yeah.
And then they said, oh, we need to make a rebrand.
Uh-huh.
And America hasn't fought a defensive war since 1812.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Why the fuck is it called the Department of Defense?
Right.
I call it the Department of Offense.
Yeah.
So the February 3rd Norfolk Southern East Palestine derailment, that's just one of the most prominent examples of the dangers of agency captures recently.
Sure, certainly.
And obviously, neither the government nor Norfolk Southern will ever lift a finger to do anything to help that community, which is now going to be a cancer cluster.
Yeah, absolutely. Forever and ever. And who are they supposed to sell their houses to? This cannot be a Ben Shapiro just move. I mean, you have this idiot Buttigieg who completely failed at even running South Bend, Indiana. He'll do absolutely nothing. Who is the oversight leader of all of this, and he won't do anything.
And I call that incident prominent guardedly, because for about a solid 2 or 3 weeks, it was not mentioned on the corporate news.
Yeah, of course not.
The only journalist I saw was people on the ground from Status Quo, a YouTube
Yeah,
channel.
Jordan Sheridan and his team. Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
they were the only people there.
Yeah. Well, and he has a good history. He's now in Western Michigan following a factory's pollution of a town there in Kalamazoo. He had a really good history following the Flint water crisis. So this is kind of a niche for him where he exposes what corporate corruption looks like when married to pliant political regimes, what it looks like on the ground for real people.
Yeah, I hear he's writing a book on the Flint water situation, which should be a corker. Hey, I got invited to submit a proposal on water and power from a global perspective from a major European publisher. I'm really excited. But
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the water book.
there's other examples that are of agency capture that are more woven into society, like the perma war, and these are considerably more damaging. But there's other examples of agency capture that are less publicized than the East Palestine derailment that are more damaging that we never hear about. And no mechanism exists to make them cease, let alone to enhance our collective ability to rebuild a decimated middle class, to restore utterly frayed social bonds, or repair the ravaged environment for the remaining decades that large-scale organized human activity will remain possible.
Mm-hmm.
And now we get to the extraordinarily gloomy ecological part of our show today. So I had a friend. I had to take a few courses outside of education in my PhD, outside of education. So I took a 600 poli-sci course, and I met a guy, and we were reading Omnivore's Dilemma, and it was talking about the omnipresence of high fructose corn syrup in our food system.
Oh, yeah.
And I said, when I took Salvia divinorum, I became the corn god. And this one guy who only started talking after an hour, he looked up and he said, "Did you become the corn god?" "Yes." "Well, I believe him." And so, game recognizes game, freak recognizes freak. So we became friends.
Sure.
And he went to the California Institute of Integral Studies outside of San Francisco, a university, to pursue his PhD because a real badass, Richard Tarnas, was there, author of Cosmo and Psyche. And he has a little chestnut I would like to share with our 5 listeners that is amazing. Political power, financial profit, technological prowess are the overriding values. The bottom line rules all. In turn, anxiety in the face of a meaningless cosmos creates a spiritual hunger and disorientation, an engulfing fear of death, and a major self-image problem, which leads to an addictive hunger for ever more material goods to fill the inner emptiness, providing a manic techno-consumerism that cannibalizes the planet in a self-destructive frenzy. Mic drop.
Yeah.
So I have combined the concept of peak everything from Heinberg with the Anthropocene to create what I call peak Anthropocene, because I think we're there now.
Yeah.
And it means to me, as an avid lover of Looney Tunes, which I will still watch to this day with delight, that we are like Wile E. Coyote. After he has run off the cliff, but before he has
He
looked,
looks down.
yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Now we turn to Hawaii. And for me, this is personal and I'm deep in it. I'm not just a researcher or an academic in it. I'm with the Hawaiian people and their struggle.
Absolutely.
And my family has been, and that's how they raised me. So the Hawaiian sovereignty movement still has much to offer to Hawaii and the world. And the Hawaiian sovereignty movement per se has many iterations, nation within a nation, like the Indians on the um, lower 48, full independence. But speaking of it very broadly, there was a really well received book called The Value of Hawaii. And the co-editors were Craig Howes and John Osorio. And Craig Howes was my mentor for my cultural studies masters. And John Osorio married the woman who was my babysitter when I was, say, age 1 to 3.
Oh, wow.
And they got married when I was about 13. So I've known him for decades. So I know both of these people very well, but I never read the book. But actually, back to water and power from a global perspective,
Mhm.
that idea came to me because there's a really great book called Land and Power in Hawaii. And it looked at how when the Democratic Party took power from the Republican Party around 1958, 60, that they just started passing out all the real estate deals to themselves
Sure.
and their cronies. And that was the period when development in Hawaii just started to skyrocket.
Hmm.
And when I taught in Cambodia, well, he got me my first job teaching, being a professor in Cambodia, George Cooper. And he and I became great friends. And I was always, George, we need to write a water and power, but in the world book. And he's a lawyer in Cambodia for peasant land rights and taking. I'm too busy securing land rights for Cambodian poor people and taking Cambodian generals to court. I don't want to write anymore.
Sure.
Although I did write this big water thing before Land and Power, and here it is. Read it. And I have another friend who is on the Land Use Commission, chairman of the Land Use Commission here, and his thesis at Yale Forestry was on Waihole water controversy, which is a really big deal here. So he knows water. So I said, Jonathan, let's write a water and power book. And he's, I never got a response from him. So I've had this idea bubbling around. And George came to Hawaii in the last few weeks. and we hung out. And we made the rounds and had some fun and met with some, high powered people in the arts and the Hawaiian movement and literature and all that. And one of them had a bookstore, and so I finally bought Value of Hawaii. And I finally read, well, I read a lot of it, but I read John Osorio's chapter on the value of Hawaiian affairs.
Mm-hmm.
This is 10 years ago. So I'm like, oh God, why did it take me 10 years to read this book that my two mentors wrote?
Sure.
But I finally did. So the rest of what we're going to talk about relates to John Osorio's The Value of Hawaiian Affairs chapter in The Value of Hawaii. And he wrote that Hawaii suffers almost a total dependence, neo-colonial dependence. That, quote, an almost total dependence on the global market system for its survival,
Mm-hmm.
which we do. We import 95% of our food and
Yeah.
virtually all of everything else. I've heard we've got 5 days of food if a hurricane hits.
Wow.
And he also noted that the attraction to the sovereignty movement, this movement for Hawaiian rights and independence and access to land and water, that the part of the attraction to the sovereignty movement is in part due to, quote, a blooming dissatisfaction with global modernity and the international consumerism that drives it. So you see, I'm starting to tie it back to the themes that we discussed previously.
Absolutely.
The movement also offers profound correctives to the intense malaise that certainly the Tarnas quote addressed, but that we've spoken of throughout this whole podcast. It offers profound correctives to this malaise because that characterizes peak Anthropocene, because, quote, Pacific Islander cultural hallmarks include a definition of wealth that is indicated by family relations, healthy lifestyles, and community connections, in addition to monetary security. So you see, it's something completely different than what's on offer in late modernity, consumer capitalism, the twilight of international finance capital, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And central to this movement are what are called the ceded lands. How much should I freestyle on the history of Hawaii? What say ye, Mark?
What you see fit, because it's so relevant. I mean, no different than Haiti being the only successful slave revolt in human history. No different than the French coming together for their fake revolution to supposedly cast off serfdom and switch to our current iteration. What you're saying matters. This Hawaii situation matters. The Hawaiian situation isn't much different than something like Bangladesh that's going to cause a mass exodus. There's so much synergy there. So I think that you should just walk people through what you see fit in that area, because there's so much overlay.
I think I will. Because the end point is that it could be a model in certain areas, to survive the ecological catastrophe to come that we've outlined.
That's right. Yeah.
And that it provides models for values that are utterly lost.
Yeah.
In peak Anthropocene.
That's right.
So I will freestyle a bit and try and keep it brief. Ahem. The Hawaiians came uh, from Tahiti. There's a range of when, perhaps from 100 AD to 1100 AD. It's a matter of archaeological and cultural historical contention. Tahiti and the Marquesas, and they arrived. They made a vibrant civilization. Their population, when Captain Cook arrived in 1778, is also a matter of contention. I would say the range is from 300,000 to a million, and we're not much more than a million now, maybe 1.3. So Cook arrives in 1788, I believe, and a chief from the Kohala district of the Big Island, the island of Hawaii, Kamehameha, unites all the islands except for Kauai, although he eventually unites Kauai. He establishes a royal dynasty over all of the archipelago. And I believe in 1820, the missionaries from New England arrive. And the Ali'i, under their influence, convert to Christianity and take them as important advisors. And they see the writing on the wall, or the just global affairs in general, and realize that what they need to do is make themselves a constitutional monarchy with significant Western trappings to avoid being colonized. And as a part of that, and so they do. And as a part of that, they chose one of their advisors. I forgot his name, so I'm not going to say it. I presented a paper on it 20 years ago at a conference. But this advisor was their advisor on political economy. He wasn't using Marx or any of the most cutting edge texts. But one of the things that he advised the monarchy to do was to create private property. Land use had been traditional. The common people, the Maka'aina, pretty much had tenure over their land and their water, and the chiefs could come and go to a degree. One of the major land use divisions was called the Ahupua'a, typically a pie-shaped division from the ocean to the mountains that could often be self-sufficient, and they would just trade among themselves. But without getting too deep into it, they had a very functional land use system that was not private property. But to assume the trappings of a westernized constitutional monarchy, they initiated what was called the Great Mahele. Mahele means to divide, to parcel out. in, I believe, 1848, beginning in 1848. It took some time. And this dispossessed a lot of the common people of their land. And this was the moment that, and then they introduced a legal act to allow foreigners to own land. And it was a major source of the dispossession of the common people in particular from their land. I heard a teacher here teaching the Great Mahele to her class. And she said, okay, everybody register your chairs or you won't have them tomorrow. And everyone's, whatever, grab their backpacks out the door. And then the next day, there were no chairs.
Yeah.
Because they didn't register them.
Sure.
Because it was an alien concept to these students.
Mm-hmm.
As it was an alien concept to the people that were working the land through traditional land use paradigms.
Yeah.
So in addition to that, through that, being dispossessed wholesale from their land, they didn't have immunity from Western diseases. So there was a massive, massive die-off of humans, of Hawaiians, of Kanaka Maoli. And I think that is enough to set the stage for January 17th, 1893. 7 men, Americans or Hawaiian subjects, because it was a multiracial constitutional kingdom, multiracial citizenship, Americans and Hawaiian subjects of the Kingdom of Hawaii of American descendants. Because after the first missionaries came, the first generation were missionaries, and the second generation became business people.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
Mostly sugar.
Yeah.
And the saying goes, they came to do good and did very well.
Mm-hmm.
So these were 7 sugar barons, so-called Committee of Safety, and they wanted to overthrow the Queen Liliuokalani. And they were not having much luck at it on that fateful day. So they beseeched American Ambassador John Stevens to land American Marines to help their cause. I forget the precise number, 172. I saw a figure in my research yesterday, 300. I think it was 172, but American Marines. And they disembarked from Honolulu Harbor, which is not far from Iolani Palace. And they pointed their artillery at the palace and made the queen abdicate. Now, I believe she might have thought that the precedent of 1840, English Lord Palmerston took over the islands, and Queen Elizabeth said, those are not our islands, give them back. That she would be reinstated. She was not reinstated. There's more to say, but I want to get into the ceded lands and tie this up. The ceded lands were the crown lands. The crown lands were the lands that were the possession of the crown. They passed from each sovereign king or queen. And it's 1.8 million acres. It's a little over a quarter of all of the acreage of the state. It's no small amount. So I believe it was Grover Cleveland sent an emissary, John Blount, to examine the situation, and he said, this is a total put-up job, and we need to reinstate the queen. And he said, Queen Liliuokalani, who was imprisoned in her own palace, and I finally got to visit the palace just a few months ago. And I was in the room where she was imprisoned. And part of the thing, one activity she did to pass the time was to quilt with one of her devoted servants. And it was enormously moving. So Cleveland's emissary, Blount, I believe was a representative from Georgia, said, Queen, we will make every effort to reinstate you if you will pardon these conspirators. And she said, no, I'll try them for treason. And he said, oh, yeah. And he went back to DC. And at that point, that's when the conspirators that overthrew the queen said, oh, America, back out of our internal affairs. Now we are the Republic of Hawaii.
Right.
That's starting in 1893. They took the crown lands. In 1898, we had the Spanish-American War, which for the lower 48 was mostly about Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
But Admiral John Dewey took it upon himself to steam, I don't know where he was, Hong Kong, somewhere, but he steamed into Manila and sunk the entire Spanish fleet in the harbor. And suddenly America also had Philippines, where they killed 300,000 people in the ensuing years. But that also internationalized it. And when America realized that it had suddenly become an overseas empire, that Hawaii could provide a very important role, particularly because Pearl Harbor offered safe moorage and water and supplies for their fleet.
Yeah, and this is the continuation of their manifest destiny to try and get cattle and other goods into Asia. You're exactly right.
Well, and they saw, after they slaughtered 300,000 Filipinos, which were prefiguring a lot of the strategic Hamlet concept in Vietnam. We had to burn the village to save it.
Right.
But they saw the Philippines as an entrepot, an access point to the China market. Back to the China market. Yeah. Oil for the lamps of China.
Yeah, that's right.
So if they use the Philippines to access the China market, then Hawaii becomes very useful as a way station to get to the Philippines.
That's right.
So they acceded to the request of the Republic of Hawaii to become a territory, and they were annexed as a territory in 1898. The Crown lands then transferred again to the territory of Hawaii. And then when Hawaii became a state in, I believe, 1959, they had to make mention of them in the Admissions Act. And they were as they were transferred to the Republic and then to the territory, now they were transferred to the state. And Section 5F of the Admissions Act stipulates 5 uses for these ceded lands, so-called ceded lands, crown lands. And one of the 5 was for the betterment of the condition of Native Hawaiians. So this has become the legal basis for the Hawaiian people's determination to have access and use, more than that, of the land and the water of these lands, and income from the harbors and the airports, because Honolulu Harbor is ceded lands, Honolulu Airport is ceded lands, and because duty-free shops are based on the actuality of the airport, also duty-free shop income. There's a word in Hawaiian called pu'uhonua. It means place of refuge. There's a famous one that's a national park south of Kona on the Big Island. And in that one, if you were accused of a crime, if you could get there, you were safe. You had to stay within that place, but you were safe. Pu'uhonua, a place of refuge. So I think one of the most incredibly striking theses of John Osorio's article, The Value of Hawaiian Affairs in the Value of Hawaii, is, quote, "What we need is a pu'uhonua from the market system. And it needs to be large enough and capitalized enough to give people the opportunity to live a life directly nourished by the land," end quote. So, in spite of the very strong likelihood that peak anthropocene, my snappy phrase, means that human civilization as we practice it now is terminal. And we are likely to revert to Neolithic population levels within decades in the context of an ecologically ravaged planet. Nevertheless, Professor Osorio's profound thesis is truly the value of Hawaiian affairs for Hawaii and the world, in spite of the dire condition of the world today, and no realistic prospect of it ever improving.
That's right.
Hawaii is one of the regions with the best potential in the world to provide the radically decentralized food, water,
Yeah.
sewage,
Yeah.
power, security that will be essential for the few small communities that can survive the coming cataclysm in any meaningful way.
Yeah.
A cataclysm that will be not Mad Max overnight, but will be characterized by a slow series of cascading geopolitical, ecological, and economic shocks. But ideally in Hawaii, we may be doing it by means of a revitalized Hawaiian cultural practices, agriculture, technology, and spirituality, nourished by the great Hawaiian Renaissance of the 1970s. And I'll conclude on a quick freestyle of the Hawaiian Renaissance. The Hawaiian language was almost dead. It was spoken by a few tutus, a few old women, a few aunties. Hawaiian ways were not respected. Westernization was and Western consumer values were the modus operandi of the day. But there was a desire to regain the language and cultural pride. And at a minimum. And two key events led to this resurgence. You're, I'm sure, well aware of Alcatraz and the occupation by the American Indian movement.
Sure. Yes.
Want to say a few words because I've been talking a lot.
No.
Talk about
Go ahead.
Yeah. As the American Indian movement took over Alcatraz to say, this is Indian land and listen to us and give us what we demand. So too did Hawaiians realize that they had a similar island called Kaho'olawe, which was taken over by the military, I guess shortly after World War II, maybe before, I'm not exactly sure. But they took it, the military took it over and just used it to bomb the shit out of it and do military training.
Mm-hmm.
It is a kino lau, a body form of Kanaloa, one of the four important gods. And it was a navigational school, which we'll tie in to that later. Because, okay, if Hawaiians arrived, some of the range is 100 AD to 1100 AD, they're doing 2,000-mile open ocean sails centuries before Europeans are hugging the coast.
Yeah.
And they had a navigational school there to help them do so. And so a number of brave activists, Emmett Aluli, George Helms, Kimo Mitchell, I'm sure I'm forgetting a few. They occupied it. They just went there and stayed and evaded the military as long as they could. And Chemo Mitchell and George Helms, and George Helms was like a charismatic, handsome leader like Fred Hampton, but also a very gifted entertainer with a beautiful falsetto. And a group coalesced called the Protect Ho'olave Ohana. Ohana means family. And Chemo Mitchell, I pray to God I got that name right, and George Helms, on one of their attempts to get to the island, were lost at sea. And that remains, no one knows what happened to them. There's a lot of the military, the mob, who knows? No one knows.
Yeah.
In any event, they were lost. Or not lost, but they are in the sea somewhere. And the persistence of the Protect Ho'olave and the activists physically landing on the island was a very important catalyst for realizing land rights, so many other rights in train. And the other most important, how can a Caucasian say what is most important?
Sure.
But I will for the purposes of this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
The other most important was a sailing canoe built in the traditional way called hokulea, because there was some anthropological debate about how did the Hawaiians get to Hawaii. And Norwegian, I think he's Norwegian, adventurer Thor Heyerdahl said, well, maybe they floated there on reed rafts from South America. And the Hawaiians were incensed and amused at that hypothesis.
Sure.
And set about to prove how they did do it, which was by large double-hulled canoes capable of sailing many, many days for at least 2,000 miles in the open ocean using celestial navigation and other techniques. And so they built the Hokulea and they sailed to Tahiti, proving that that is how it was done. And that became a focal point of pride as well. And in another sailing of the Hokulea, it capsized. And legendary big wave surfer and waterman Eddie Aikau went to go get help. And I am hanai'd into the Aikau family. Hanai means it's the traditional Hawaiian way of informal adoption. I'm a part of the Aikau family. And my dad, he fell off a cliff during the search to look for Eddie and broke his leg. And that's when they called off what had been at that point about a 2-week search. So he too was lost at sea. And this poster behind me is the Eddie Aikau Big Wave Surfing Competition, the Eddie Aikau Invitational, held at Waimea Bay only when it's 20 feet or larger and perfect. A bay where he was a lifeguard, where he patched me up one day when I was a little boy. And the Aikau family is also the direct lineal descendants of Heva Heva, who was the kahuna nui of King Kamehameha I. Kahuna nui is chief spiritual advisor. And there is a great heiau, a religious structure on a bluff above Waimea Bay that was built at the command of Heva Heva. So Heva Heva built that heiau above the bay. Eddie Aikau was a lifeguard in the bay. That family's roots in that bay go back a long time.
Yeah.
And of course, Eddie Aikau was a legendary pioneering big wave surfer. And one of his favorite spots was Waimea. So he was he was a lifeguard there. So he's a waterman par excellence. So if anyone could have gone to look for help to save the crew of the capsized Hokulea,
Sure.
So it was those two incidents and those two movements in particular, the Hokulea and long distance traditional voyaging and the Protect Ko'olave Ohana and their actions on Ko'olave to get them to stop the bombing, clear goal, stop the bombing, that precipitated what is called the Hawaiian Renaissance. This rippled out in many ways to lead to a massive resurgence of interest in teaching in Olelo Hawaii, the Hawaiian language, and traditional cultural practices, traditional gathering, and just a plethora of all of the many ways it meant of what it meant to be Hawaiian on this land, using these waters and on this ocean. And the Hawaiian Renaissance was a resurrection of the Hawaiian pride, the Hawaiian people, the Hawaiian language, and so many other things, so intimately tied to one another. So that's why I say that we're facing a cataclysm worldwide that will be faced by a series of cascading economic, ecological, and geopolitical shocks. But Hawaii may survive it by means of the revitalized Hawaiian cultural practices, agriculture, technology, spirituality that is informed by and nourished by the Hawaiian Renaissance. And on that note, I think we should say aloha to this edition of the Hardline According to Stone Fruit with my friend and podcasting partner, Mark French.
Great work, man. Great piece.